Boldwood presents The Other Gwyn Girl, written by Nicola Cornick, and read by Naomi Cooper and Lucy Scott. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Prologue. Rose, Oxford, February 1650. A bitter wind blew down Magpie Lane, sending the snowflakes swirling. A single lantern, high on the wall of Christchurch College, cast a dancing shadow as we passed beneath it and slipped through the doorway into Merton College gardens. Mother held me tight by the hand. In her other arm, she cradled the baby, who had wailed for the whole journey from our lodgings in Botley, her voice a thin, high thread, tiny but determined. "Be quick, Rose," Mother said, when I stumbled, tiredness and cold pulling me down. "Nell will catch a chill if you dawdle along like this." She sounded both cross and distracted. She always did. I was 5 years old and could remember a time before, when it had been summer and we had lived in the country. Father had been there, and the sun had shone every day. Now it was perpetual winter. Father had gone, and Nell had arrived. The gardens were shrouded in darkness, and the path was lost beneath the snow. But a lamp burned in a downstairs window. Mother released my hand and hurried towards it, a moth to the flame. I ran to keep up. I saw her rap on the pane 3 times sharply. A door opened, and we were bundled inside. "Why must Nell have her horoscope cast tonight?" I had asked Mother earlier, when she had told me we were to go out into the city that night. I had been warm, or at least as warm as I could be in our draughty garret rooms, and was drowsily contemplating my hot milk and my cot, because the timing of such celestial matters is critical, Mother had said sharply. "Why?" I pressed again. "Because Mr. Ashmole says so." "Why? Why do you always ask so many questions, Rose?" I think Mother had been tempted to leave me behind that night, but feared that Mrs. Culpepper, who owned the lodging house, might kidnap me and sell me in payment for our rent arrears. Oxford was a dangerous place in the winter of early 1650. The Puritans had finally crushed the spirit that had made the city such a stronghold of royalist support under the late King Charles I. Informers, spies and enforcers abounded. Masterless men roamed the streets. Old soldiers and their families were left to starve, and the shadow of death stalked the narrow alleyways. People hid behind their shuttered windows. There were those at the university who still lived in grand style. We were in a big, shadowy room, a library lit by candlelight, lined with bookcases and decorated with huge white heads carved from stone. It was a rich man's room, smelling of pipe smoke and the lingering scents of a roast dinner. I stared about me, dripping, melting snow onto the soft carpet beneath my feet, and then I saw the open fire and hurried towards it to thaw my frozen fingers. I climbed up into the huge armchair directly beside it and settled in, luxuriating in the heat. "Rose!" Mother exclaimed, but the man who had come forward to greet her only laughed. "The little maid knows what she wants and takes it," he said. "It is not a bad philosophy for life." "Rose rushes headlong towards everything," Mother said. Her bitterness was clear. "She does not think. She's just like her father." I loved my father dearly and could see nothing wrong in being in his image, but evidently my mother did not agree. The stranger, however, knelt beside my chair to see me more clearly, affording me the chance to assess him too. He was a big man with a florid face and wide forehead, his eyes narrow and bright with intelligence, a reddish hue to his long curly hair, and with fine lace at his neck and wrists. A gentleman of substance, then. The sort of man Father had once been, and a scholar, too, which Father most certainly had never been. "Well, well, Mistress Rose Gwyn," he said. "I am Elias Ashmole." The name meant nothing to me, other than that this was the man whom Mother had said we must consult to draw up baby Nell's horoscope. But when he turned to a hovering maidservant and sent her away to fetch warm chocolate for me, I decided I would love him forever. Meanwhile, Mother had taken the seat offered beside Mr. Ashmole's desk, which was littered with papers of all kinds and books open at what appeared to be random pages. Nell, whose wailing had dropped to a low grizzle and then died away altogether, was now being admired. I could imagine her gazing at Mr. Ashmole with her big blue eyes, wrapping her tiny fingers around his. As I sipped my warm chocolate from the beaker the maid presented, I listened to his words. "An elfin child, so sweetly pretty. You say you saw a star shooting across the sky on the night she was born? Some see that as a harbinger of doom, but I consider it a very auspicious sign. I will draw up her chart for you now." The combined effect of the soft scratching of Mr. Ashmole's quill as he sketched the chart, the warmth of the fire, and the comfort of the hot chocolate made me very sleepy. As I drifted in, her sun is in Aquarius. She will be a lively and creative personality. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The moon, in the house of Cancer, the crab. Mr. Ashmole's voice had a slight uncertainty to it, but then the confidence returned. A very loyal and passionate person. Capricorn rising. He let out a chuckle. A determined individual, then. Nothing will stand in her way. I knew it! Mother sounded excited. I knew she was destined for great things when I saw the star in the sky overhead on the night of her birth. Like the baby Jesus, I said. Both of them looked at me. Well, perhaps not quite, Mr. Ashmole said. He peered at me over the top of his spectacles. Do you wish me to do your chart as well, little maid? When were you born? I don't know, I said, but I'm nearly 5 years old. Mr. Ashmole looked inquiringly at Mother. It was in the dark days of the summer of 45, she said, when the king's fortunes had turned. Then, lowering her voice, we do not speak of it. I see, Mr. Ashmole said. There would be no horoscope for me, then. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I dozed. Scorpio in mid-heaven, Mr. Ashmole murmured. Oh, there will be challenges along her path, no question about it, but she will triumph over them. I want her to be happy, Mother said, suddenly vehement. I want her to be safe. She will be more than that, Mr. Ashmole promised. She will be celebrated, and she will know a great love. Oh, love! Mother sniffed. I would rather hear that she will marry a rich man for his fortune. I do not see a marriage. Mr. Ashmole cleared his throat. One must remember, madam, that a horoscope is not prescriptive, only a guide to the path the child might take. I slid off my chair and went to stand beside the desk, curious to see the chart he was creating. I was too short to see over the edge, so Mr. Ashmole drew up a stool for me to sit on. I was disappointed that the horoscope, which sounded so intriguing, was completely incomprehensible, no more than a wheel of squiggles, letters, and odd symbols. Is it magic? I ventured, tracing a finger over one of the drawings, which looked like a wiggling worm. No, little maid, Mr. Ashmole said firmly. It is science, not magic. It takes a skilled scholar to interpret a chart. I could not see that this would be of much use to baby Nell, who would not be able to read it. But I was glad it was not magic. Our father had shown me some magic tricks last summer when we were at Beacote Manor, making ribbons and buttons disappear, and Daisy— Always believe in magic, pet, he had told me. But the only magic that had happened since then was that both father and the manor had disappeared, apparently for good. Mr. Ashmole finished the horoscope with a flourish. I will have a clerk copy it for you tomorrow and deliver it to your lodgings, he promised. The original will stay in my collection, of course, for the scholars of the future to study. This all sounded rather grand to me. Would scholars of the future be interested in my baby sister? But Mother seemed impressed, and she reached into the hem of her skirt and took out a small bag of money. I heard the clink of coins as she held it out to Mr. Ashmole. With my thanks, sir, she said. I wanted to cry out to her not to give the last of our money away, for I had had nothing but bone broth and gruel to eat for the past week. But Mr. Ashmole, fortunately, refused. Dear madam, He pushed the hand holding the money away gently. "I would not dream of it. Keep your coins to feed your girls, and in recognition of our shared loyalties." He dropped his voice. "I was very sorry to hear about Captain Gwyn. Out of respect for his father, the late canon, I wish I could help you. But, alas." He did not explain why the help would not be forthcoming, and he was already crossing the library to usher us back out of the door and into the cold. The icy draught that wrapped around my legs was a shock that almost made me cry out. I could not imagine attempting to walk back to the garret in Botley through these snowdrifts. Mr. Ashmole, however, seemed keen to be rid of us now that the horoscope was cast. "Remember, Madam Gwyn," he called out almost gaily, "there is a brilliant future ahead of your younger daughter. Have faith." Faith would not feed us, nor would it warm us, I thought, as the cold bit into my toes. I remembered his words again when I was lying in my cot at our lodgings. Mother snoring beside me, and baby Nell snuffling in her sleep like a little piglet. Fortunately, in St. Giles, we had met a carter trudging home with his 2 huge dray horses. He had exclaimed to find anyone out in such inclement weather, and had given us a ride in the cart as far as New Osney, so we were not too chilled when at last we had arrived home. Nell would have a brilliant future. But what about me? I drew the thin blanket up closer beneath my chin and decided that I would forge my own future. It would contain warm fires and chocolate and thick, cosy carpets. The following day, true to his word, Mr. Ashmole sent a clerk to our lodgings with Nell's horoscope in a scroll tied with a blue ribbon. Mother was in raptures and went to sit by the window to pore over it in the winter light. She did not see the other, smaller scroll that the clerk took from his sleeve and pressed into my hands with the whispered words that Mr. I waited until Mother had gone out to beg for some stale bread to feed us. Then I took her place on the window seat and unrolled it. As with Nell's chart, there were diagrams and curves, squiggles and letters, none of which made any sense to me. I was disappointed. But not for long, for the cream ribbon that tied it suited my auburn hair very well. Folding the chart, I put it away in the old treasure tin I kept beneath my bed, whose only other contents were the knife my father had left me, the key to the fishing house at Beacote Manor, which Mother had told me I could keep because it was worthless, some battered wooden soldiers, a thimble, and a shiny gold button. When Mother wasn't looking, I also took the blue ribbon from Nell's scroll and hid it until she had forgotten about it, then took it out and cut it in half to tie my plaits. All in all, I thought I'd done quite well by Mr. Ashmole.
Chapter 1. Jess, the Present, late March. "Welcome to Fortune Hall," the sign said. It was wooden, painted in a whimsical vintage style, with horseshoes, 4-leaf clovers, and various other good luck symbols. Rather incongruously, it was hanging from a metal spike on the top of a steel gate that was about as welcoming as a slap across the face. It reminded Jess rather too much of the place she had left half an hour before, the open prison at Bright Hill, where her ex-boyfriend was currently residing at His Majesty's pleasure. "I don't suppose you'll come to visit me again," Jared had said rather plaintively, when she had pushed back the plastic chair and got up to leave. "Not that I blame you. It's all been a bit of a nightmare." "Especially for the people you defrauded," Jess had agreed. Jared's self-absorption was extraordinary. Even now, after a high-profile trial and a conviction based on an overwhelming pile of evidence, he was still protesting his innocence and complaining that his life had been ruined. Jess looked through the car window at the painted 4-leaf clovers on the sign. Luck. They said that you made your own. And certainly she felt she had been the architect of her own bad luck through being so oblivious to Jared's faults. For over 2 years she had been taken in by his winning charm and the way he had made her mundane existence seem exciting. For once, her life had seemed almost as dazzling as that of her younger sister Tavy, except that it had all been an illusion. Now, having said a final goodbye to Jared, she realised she didn't even feel sad, only angry and exhausted. Jess's losses, the flat she and Jared had once shared, her security, her savings and her self-confidence and faith in her own judgment were all casualties of the mess, but they felt insignificant compared to the victims of Jared's investment scam. Elderly people had lost their life savings, students the means to fund their education. Night after night, Jess lay awake, tormented by their stories and the desire to make amends. Even though the police had cleared her of any involvement in Jared's criminality, she felt responsible. She felt she should have known. Her sister Tavy's fame had meant that the whole case had been splashed across the news as well. Cheating trader brother-in-law of reality TV star Tavy Yates steals the dreams of thousands was one of the less lurid, albeit inaccurate, headlines. It was going to take her a while to get back on her feet. Coming to Fortune Hall was a stopgap, Jess told herself. A temporary measure to buy her some time and give her a place to hide away until she felt a bit more resilient. Tavy had suggested it, which was very generous of her under the circumstances. Under normal circumstances, Jess would have flatly refused, as she and her sister were polar opposites in just about everything, and spending any time under the same roof as Tavy was bound to end badly. But since Jared, normal circumstances didn't exist anymore, and Jess felt a surprising urge to take refuge with her family. Like all her other ideas lately, she thought, it was probably a bad one. She switched off the car, got out, and walked towards the steel gates. They were set between two old lodge houses. Both were squat buildings, stone and foursquare, obviously empty. Through the blank windows, she glimpsed fallen masonry and broken beams. The steel fence extended along the road for as far as Jess could see. It was even more secure than the prison had been. She almost expected to see security guards patrolling with dogs. It was very quiet. Although the main road to Oxford was only a mile away, here down this narrow country lane, there were no cars and no other signs of life, of the humankind at least. There were plenty of birds singing and unidentified animals scuffling through the grass verges, although Jess could not see them. After living in London for the past 3 years, she found the quiet unnerving. It felt as though she could hear it. It was a presence, and it made the hair on her neck rise slightly, as though someone was watching her. The gates were even bigger and more imposing at close quarters, the welcome sign even more incongruous. Jess recognized it as the logo from the credits of Tavy's latest TV program. Her sister, a well-known style influencer and celebrity, was in the throes of redesigning a derelict country house for no other reason that Jess could see than that it was the latest in a long line of rescues she had performed. Tavy's brand was to pick random neglected objects, whether abandoned kittens or vintage furniture, and give them a fresh start in life. Not that Jess watched many of Tavy's programs, but she did know that her sister spent much of her life under a lens. Someone was watching her, Jess realised. 2 cameras were poised on posts above the gate, pointing beadily in her direction. Jess pressed it and waited. The day was very still. No more than a hint of breeze stirred the bare branches of the trees. There was a whisper of spring in the air, and clusters of primroses were growing wild on the bank inside the fence. Distant traffic noise came from the main road a mile away, blended with the drone of an aeroplane overhead and the cawing of whatever the big black birds were that were clustered in the tops of the trees. Crows, rooks, jackdaws. Jess couldn't remember which was which. She didn't dislike the country, simply felt out of place in it. Fortune Hall! The tinny voice from the metal box startled her. It sounded bored. Jess Yates to see Tavy Yates, she said, adding, I'm her sister. I have an appointment. There was another, agonizingly long pause. Jess pulled her coat more closely about her. The pale March sun had an edge of warmth to it, but here in the shadows there was a chill. She got out her phone. If they didn't let her in soon, she would have to call Tavy direct. She hated doing that. Her sister always sounded in a mad rush and made her feel as though she was a nuisance. There was a metallic clunk and a grinding sound, and the steel gates started to open. The Welcome to Fortune Hall sign clattered against its spike. Jess ran back to the car, started the engine, thrust it into gear, and shot through the gap before it could close again. She felt slightly out of breath as she watched the metal gate slam shut behind her. Trespassers will be prosecuted, the sign at the side of the drive read. So much for the Welcome to Fortune Hall. Tavy loved her fans, or so she always said, but evidently she didn't want them to get too close to her. There was no one in sight, not even a building, nothing but a long drive lined with trees that disappeared over the top of a slight rise. Green lawns sloped away on either side, dotted with more trees. It looked like an expensively manicured golf course. Jess drove slowly. Now that she was almost there, she felt a treacherous urge to turn around and flee back to London. Her friend Sammy had offered her a sofa to sleep on. At the same time, she had also offered her the advice that meant Jess couldn't accept it. "This is a good opportunity to spend some time with your mum and your sister, Jess. You know how much you've regretted drifting apart from them." Jess paused, the view of elegant green lawns blurring suddenly and unexpectedly as her eyes misted with tears. She was tired and lonely, and the memory of Sammy's words struck home. There had been no dramatic estrangement from her mother and younger sister, more a slow neglect. Tavy's life as a presenter and influencer had been a world away from her work at Canada Water Library in South London. They had had little in common as children, and Jess clenched her hands around the steering wheel. "Focus," she thought. "Breathe." A squirrel sauntered across the drive ahead of her and shot up a tree. She watched its bushy grey tail disappear and noticed that the trees were old, some with huge, thick branches and hollowed-out trunks. A flicker of sensation feathered across her senses then, something that took her out of the tumble of nerves and preoccupations. Fortune Hall was on old land, a place with ancient roots that lay beneath Tavy's attempts to modernise and brand it in her own style. It had a life and an identity of its own that had existed centuries ago, and Jess could feel the presence of that history all around her. As the Mini crested the hill, Jess shook off the fanciful thought, only for it to return with greater force as she finally saw Fortune Hall over to her right at the foot of a slight hill, and beyond it a lake that gleamed silver in the faint spring sunshine. The house was built of a grey limestone and should have looked dull, but it seemed to glitter in the light with the insubstantial air of a fairy castle. The basic shape was a rectangle, with two small wings attached that formed a U-shape around a modest courtyard. In a later period, someone had evidently added bay windows, a couple of balconies, and some ill-advised turrets. The overall effect was of a house in fancy dress. Then Jess saw the marquees on the lawn outside, the TV broadcast equipment, the lorries, lights and gantries, all the paraphernalia of filming. And when she looked at the house again, it had shrunk back to a plain grey shell with no character, nothing more than an empty set for Tavy's series. She parked a short distance away from the entrance and decided to leave her suitcase in the car for now. The place was oddly silent. She couldn't see anyone from the camera crew, and the door of the house, oak with studded ironwork, was firmly closed. No one came out to meet her. Standing on the gravel, seeing the house at close quarters, Jess could see what had drawn Tavy to this particular tumble-down renovation project for her show. It looked so forlorn and dishevelled. Tavy's brand of taking something that was old or unloved and making it shiny and new again was perfect for this house. There was no bell, so Jess raised her hand to knock at the door, but before she made contact, it swung open. Tavy was there, radiant in a scarlet wide-legged jumpsuit with balloon sleeves. Beyond her stood their mother in a floral playsuit, black tights and stilettos, and behind her an entire film crew with cameras rolling. "Jess!" Her sister enveloped her in a scented hug, teetering in high red platform heels. "Welcome to Fortune Hall, babes. It's so good to see you again." Her silky fair hair brushed Jess's cheek. She'd never been big into public displays of affection, particularly with an audience, and there was a hell of an audience here. No one had warned her that her reunion with her sister would be televised. The camera closed in on Tavy wiping a tear from the corner of her eye and lingered on Jess's face. It felt intrusive and wrong. Jess stumbled backwards, almost tripping over the sumptuous multicoloured rag rug on the polished wooden floor. What sort of expression she was wearing was anyone's guess. Shock, horror, embarrassment, all three and more. She hadn't even brushed her hair, and she was crumpled and travel-stained. She hadn't seen many episodes of Welcome to Fortune Hall, but she could imagine the voiceover for this one. That allegianous actor Hal Price intoning, "Can the stakes get any higher? Now it's not only the house that needs some love. Can Tavy Yates work her magic on her own family and heal the hurt? It's her biggest challenge yet." Jess wondered how she could have been so naive. She was the loser sister whose boyfriend had ruined so many people's lives. Tavy would pick her up, make her shiny and new again, and her fans would call her a saint. Never mind the house renovation. She was Tavy's latest rescue project.
Chapter 2. Rose. The Marshalsea, London, July 1671. This was the third time in my life that I had been in jail. The first time I was 13 and had stolen a loaf of bread so that Nell and I might eat. Although I was usually a quick and clever thief, that day I was slow and stupid. I was caught, imprisoned, and branded with a T on my wrist to wear my shame publicly forever, so the judge decreed. Only the fact that I was a child restrained him from having me hanged. The second time I was 15 and Nell was 11. Our mother, who was habitually too drunk to turn a profit in her bawdy house, could not pay the rent, and so we lost that roof from over our heads and were locked up for debt. By then, I was old enough to understand how to use any scrap of advantage I had. I sent a letter to the newly returned King Charles II asking for clemency on the grounds that our late father had supported him in the wars and lost his entire fortune in royal service. To my astonishment, the king ordered our release. This time, the third, I was 26 years old, and I was in jail for treason. My crime was that I had been an accomplice in the attempted theft of the crown jewels. Fortunately, there were several possibilities open to me before I was burned at the stake for my crime. I could plead marital coercion and blame everything on my husband. As he was a known highwayman and a notorious villain, this had some authenticity. I could claim I was The drawback to that would be that they could still condemn me to death after the babe was born, and the mere thought of that turned my stomach to ice. No one and nothing was going to separate me from my child. There was one more option. I could throw myself on the mercy of the one woman who might help me, the little sister from whom I had parted on bad terms 3 years before, when I had married John Cassels, and she had had the effrontery to tell me I was making a mistake. "He's no good, Rose," Nell said bluntly. "He's a wastrel. He'll come to a bad end and he will drag you down with him." How Nell would laugh to be proved correct. How I wished we had never argued over a man, least of all one as unworthy as John Cassels. But my pride was nothing compared to my life, and even more important was the future of my unborn baby. I had lost the last one. I would do everything in my power to protect this child, even beg Nell to help me. I beckoned the jailer over. She was a slovenly woman, only a few years older than I at a guess, who spent half her time poking and pinching us for the fun of it, and the other half drinking and flirting with the male warders. In my experience, the women jailers were worse than the men, more cruel, more mean-spirited. It was a career of a sort for a woman who did not mind spending her days in the dank, stench-ridden bowels of the jails, but living in perpetual dark had never appealed to me. The pay was but a fraction of a male warder, so the females made up for it by stealing what small items they could take from their charges, beating us for the fun of it, pulling our hair. All of their frustrations had an easy target in the women in their care. This jailer did not like me because I never tried to curry favour with her like the other women did, nor would I gossip. I suppose she had imagined that I would be a more tarnished version of my sister, a bawd and a bitch. "Fetch the priest for me, if you please," I said. I pressed a silver sixpence into her hand. Her eyes bulged a little when she saw it, and I knew that if she had realised that I had a coin hidden about me, she would have robbed me of it before now. "You planning on asking for the last rites, Your Majesty?" She laughed at her own wit, showing her blackened stumps of teeth. She called me Majesty or Highness all the time because of my crime. It amused her, but it had irritated me very quickly. "Or perhaps you are intent on tying the knot," she continued. "Is there a gentleman here who takes your fancy? I can arrange a tryst if all you need is a quick swiving, for we cannot be sure if your husband is dead or alive, can we? You would not want to add bigamy to treason on the charge sheet, would you? All I require is someone who can write, I said coldly. It was a constant humiliation to me that I had no learning. Our mother never... She had not understood the importance of education, whereas I knew all too well the advantages it gave. With education, a man, or even a woman, could change their life. "The priest, if you please," I repeated, "with a quill, ink and parchment." "Of course, Your Highness," she said, pocketing the additional penny I offered and dropping a mocking curtsy. "You have the manner of a knob, that's for sure, even if you have nothing else." I suppose that the jailer was right. I did have a certain peremptoriness of manner and very little on which to base it. "Never forget, girls, that you are the daughters of a gentleman," Mother had frequently told us when we were children. In practice, it had meant nothing at all, since our father had died years before and we were nobodies. Yet perhaps I had cultivated an unconscious sense of authority alongside my criminal tendencies, or perhaps I simply had a managing nature. One of us had to be practical, and Mother was usually too drunk, and Nell had her head in the clouds. The priest came. I heard the clank of the iron door, the squeak of rusty metal on metal as it opened. A fresh breeze momentarily stirred the rank air of the cell, where 20 of us were huddled together in the corners like blind mice. "Has someone else died?" the woman beside me asked, turning her face towards the lantern light, eyes wide with fear. She was shaking constantly, the ragged shreds of her gown rustling. "No," I said. "Do not trouble yourself. All is well." In jail at 13, the sight of such pitiful wretches had shocked me. Now I was hardened to it and grateful that my spirit was stronger, but how much longer it would remain so was a moot point. I shuddered. I had to get out. "Her over there," the jailer said, pointing to me. "She was the one what called you in." The priest squatted beside me on the cobbled floor, close enough that I could smell him, a mix of pomade from his hair and old sweat from his dirty robes. My throat closed with revulsion, although I have smelled much worse in my time. He tilted his head towards me, the better to hear, for it was noisy with the shouts and screams of the mad women and the chatter of the other girls echoing from the stone walls. "Write this," I said. I was pretending that I wanted a scribe because I was a lady. The truth of my illiteracy shamed me. "Dearest Nell," I began, "out of the love you bear me, I beg that you will help me now that I am in such dire need." I stopped. Was that too much? I could not be sure, although I could easily imagine my sister throwing back her head as she heard this appeal and laughing until she cried. She would know that the words were forced out of me, that I hated asking for anything from her as a point of principle. "I pray you to help me for the sake of the babe." Nell was a mother too. I thought that might stir some pity in her. "I beseech you to plead with the king for me and free me from this place," I said, whilst the priest's pen scratched across the parchment and he squinted in the pale light from the lantern, "before both I and my baby perish." "A nice touch, mistress," the priest said, "sure to melt the stoniest heart." "I am truly penitent of my crime," I finished, "and my gratitude will know no bounds." "Well put, mistress," the priest conceded, showing his tombstone teeth in a grin. "Who could resist? Do you wish to sign it with your mark?" I hesitated, then took the quill and scratched a shaky cross on the letter. Shame stirred in me again that I could not even write my own name, and with it a fury that I had to pay this charlatan to put down my words, then pay him again to deliver them. He would charge dearly, particularly when he knew where the letter was going. My money was almost all spent. I knew that when the priest had left, I would need to go out into the yard and beg for pennies from the passers-by who peered at us through the prison bars. We were the entertainment for the idle gawkers who came to jeer and crow over us. But we needed them too, for their occasional charity paid for us to stay alive. The thought sent another rush of urgency through me. I almost pushed the priest away. "Take it to number 79, Pall Mall," I said, holding out a half-guinea. I took a deep breath. Make sure it gets into the hands of Madame Nell Gwyn herself. The priest was so focused on the pale shine of the coin that for a moment the name failed to register with him. It was the jailer. Listening in, as usual, she gave a squawk. "Nell Gwyn?" she said. She gave a cackle of laughter. "Nell Gwyn? She won't help you. Don't you know they asked her about you when first Colonel Blood tried to steal the jewels? No one could believe you were her sister. She's so witty and pretty, and you neither of those, and a criminal to boot. She said that both you and that fancy highwayman husband of yours were dead to her. She isn't going to want the likes of you bringing her down." And she put her hands on her hips and laughed at the idea until the tears ran. I was afraid that the jailer was right, but I would not give her the satisfaction of admitting it. Besides, I did not know how much truth there was in her words. Gossip and rumour ran through the staff and inmates of the jail like rats through a sewer, but not all of the information was accurate. In the 6 weeks I had been in the Marshalsea, I had heard that Thomas Blood had not only been pardoned of his crime in attempting to steal the crown jewels from the Tower of London, but that it was said that he was lording it round court, full of swagger and pride. That in itself was so ridiculous as to be unbelievable to me. I had heard that my husband John, who had been one Thomas Blood's accomplices, had either been killed or had absconded abroad. No one seemed to know which. And I had heard that until they found John one way or the other, I would be held as surety for him, as well as a conspirator in my own right. It seemed not to matter that Thomas Blood had been freed. I would not be. Such was the lack of logic by which justice was served in London, and being a woman, and a destitute one at that, I had no way to challenge it. Well, I had one way. Through Nell's intervention, there was a small possibility I might be pardoned. But that would require so many things to go right, when lately everything had gone wrong. The priest had gone, concerned perhaps that he might be robbed of his half-guinea if he lingered in this nest of thieves. "He'll cheat you," one of the other girls said, looking at his retreating back as he scurried away down the corridor. "He's no real parson." "He can be the devil himself for all I care," I said, "as long as he delivers the message to my sister." Her gaze swung back to me. She was staring, eyes bright in a face smeared with dirt. Lank strands of hair hung down to her shoulders. Her gown was torn. I felt sick all of a sudden to be such a figure of curiosity. I'd always hated the attention that Nell revelled in. "Nell Gwyn?" she said. "Only fancy!" There was admiration in her voice, as though Nell was someone who had achieved something particularly fine in life, which perhaps she had. I had long observed that whilst the nobility might be contemptuous of my sister's position as the king's mistress, the ordinary people loved her. They saw her as one of them, a girl from the back streets of London who had risen to consort with the highest in the land. The truth was rather more complicated, but Nell, the consummate actress, played on their loyalty and support, especially now that the king had a new French mistress who was almost universally hated. "What is she like?" the woman asked. I knew she wanted an insight that no one but Nell's sister could give, a special glimpse into the secret life of a public figure. But my mind was blank. I thought of all the quarrels that Nell and I had had over the past 20 years, and the way we had drifted apart, firstly because as we grew up the difference in our characters had become very apparent, and then later because John had forced such a wedge between us. How had we become so estranged? I wondered, feeling suddenly tired. Blood should have been thicker than water. The woman was still looking at me expectantly. "Nell cannot cook," I said randomly, "and she is the untidiest person I ever knew." The woman looked disappointed at such a banal response, but it was the best I could do. I turned my back on her, leaned my head against the mouldy, dripping wall, and closed my eyes whilst I thought about how I, who shunned attention as much as Nell loved it, had become the most notorious woman in London. It had all begun back in January. It was a harsh winter. The shutters rattled with storms, and the cold crept under the door of our tenement to freeze us in our bed. On the night I met Thomas Blood, however, huge snowflakes were drifting gently down between the misshapen chimneys and huddled roofs of London. They made the city look magical, hiding for a brief time the dirt and decay. John, my husband, was in a good mood that evening, and for once it was not induced by drink. "Your sister performs tonight in Mr. Dryden's new play, The Conquest of Granada," he said, seated by the fire, his clay pipe in hand. "They're saying it is her last performance, now that she has produced a whelp for the king." Even though Nell and I were not close, I detested it when people spoke disparagingly of her, especially a man like John, who was far looser in his morals than Nell had ever been. For the sake of peace, though, I held my tongue. I was tired of quarrelling with him, and it felt as though that was all we had done these several months past. "They're always claiming it to be Nell's last performance," I said. "It means they can charge more to see the play." "I thought we might go," John said. "The theatre, and then a hot pie and a drink at the alehouse. What'd you say, Rose?" He got up and came over to enfold me in an enormous hug. His clothes smelled of damp, tobacco, and sweat. I pushed him away, ostensibly because I had my hands full of dirty laundry, but mostly because these days I could not bear his touch, not after what had happened the last time he had been in his cups. "You are very flush all of a sudden," I remarked. "How may we afford such indulgence?" John seldom had any work, at least not honest toil, as he felt manual labour was beneath a man who claimed to be the heir to a baronetcy and had once been an officer in the King's army. I suspected he was no more a baronet than I was a duchess, and he had certainly never been a soldier. The only time he made any money was when he robbed travellers out on the dark streets at night. He called himself a highwayman and expected the respect due to such a villain, but, in truth, he could not ride and owned no horse, which made him no more than a common footpad. "Ask no questions." He tapped the side of it. "It promises to be lucrative." I sighed. Whatever it was bound to be illegal, but at least there would be more money. Whilst I scrubbed floors and washed dishes in the inns, took in laundry and peddled goods in the markets to scrape together what pennies I could, winters were the worst times, because John was too lazy to go out and rob people in the bad weather. This scheme, whatever it was, must be taking place within doors. In the end, we did go to the theatre, I seeing no reason to refuse an outing that would involve a hot meal prepared by someone else. John, still in expansive mood, bought us seats in the pit, and I was glad I had worn my best lace-trimmed bodice and embroidered skirt. I had never been able to compete with Nell in terms of looks, for I was taller and larger all round, with a hair of darker auburn and eyes of hazel. Nell, in contrast, was a pocket goddess with fiery red hair and bright blue eyes. There was a buzz when we took our seats, and John loved that, adoring being noticed as the brother-in-law of the leading lady, even though that leading lady scorned us both. For me, the memories of the theatre were different. I had not been sorry to put it behind me. Nell and I had worked there for Orange Mole when we were little more than children, selling fruit and sweetmeats. It had been Nell's pathway to the stars, but for me it had been no more than achingly hard work for the pittance of the few pennies Mole spared us. As I grew older and less winsome, the ladies stopped cooing over me, but some of the men still wanted to pinch my cheek, and much more besides. It was a grubby world of powder and pretence. Nell saw the glamour in it, but I only saw abuse and manipulation. Now, I watched the orange girls dart among the crowds, selling their wares and the promise of themselves, carrying messages from gallants to ladies. I smelled the remembered scent of the candle wax and sawdust, and felt the press of sweaty bodies. I heard the whisper run through the audience. "It is Rose Gwyn, the sister who became a thief rather than a bawd." Self-consciously, I touched the brand on my wrist, the indelible mark that condemned me as a criminal. It could be hidden, but it could never be erased. Nell was superb, of course. The torches dimmed, she sauntered on to speak the prologue, and the house immediately went wild. She lit up the stage with her wit and her presence. For a few brief hours, the theatre was a magical place that carried us all away from our humdrum cares. I was not immune to Nell's skill, only deeply envious of it. I always had been, ever since I had realised that she had the ability to act, and, as such, to escape. Nell did not so much as glance my way. I felt the sense of regret rise when I thought about our quarrel. I had been enamoured with the idea of marriage and the pretence of respectability it brought with it, and I had not wanted to hear Nell's assessment of John's character. It was doubly annoying that she had been proved correct about him. John was indeed a bully, a braggart, and a drunkard, as I had discovered for myself all too quickly. At the end of the evening, the cheers threatened to bring down the rafters, the thunderous clapping making the building shake to its foundations. We applauded too, and Nell bowed and kissed her hand to everyone, dazzling the darling of the crowd, and yet as far removed from me now as she could possibly be. She had that talent of giving the impression that she was still the same as everyone else, and people loved her for her lack of snobbery. You could see it in their faces. They thought she was one of them. But I knew better. She had left us all behind. As the good-natured crowd spilled out into the snowy street, looking for a link boy to light them home, or, in the case of the nobles and gentry, their carriages in the melee outside, John slipped my hand through his arm and steered me towards the White Hart Inn. Covent Garden was full of people with the same idea, all jostling to get out of the cold and continue the evening's entertainment. At the side of the road, a brazier glowed warm and filled the air with the sweet, nutty scent of chestnuts. Further along, another vendor was offering hot-baked apples. John grabbed one in passing and tossed a few pennies to the street seller as though he were a lord. He bit into it heartily and swore when it burned his mouth. I was afraid he might turn back to berate the man who'd sold it, so I tugged on his arm and quickened my step. "We shall be fortunate even to get within doors," I remarked, brushing the snow out of my eyes and shrinking more deeply within my cloak. It was cold and I needed hot food to warm me. "All the world seems to be out on the town tonight." "Thomas will have secured us a place," John said confidently, his bad temper forgotten. "No one refuses him." I had some curiosity then to see this man with whom John had entered into business and who could apparently secure a spare seat in a busy alehouse. As we entered, John pushing his way forcefully through the crowd, a man equal in height and bulk to him rose from a table right beside the fire and gestured to us to join him. I recognised him, having seen him once before preening and parading himself at Whitehall with the infamous Duke of Buckingham. It was Colonel Thomas Blood, a soldier and adventurer who was said to do the Duke's dirty work for him, a man without morals or conscience. "Why, it is Colonel Blood," I said. I shot John. John's hand gripped my arm almost too tightly. I sensed bluster in him, but also nervousness. Thomas Blood was a man who would make most other men quail, and women too. I felt a shiver of revulsion run down my spine. "Be nice to him," he hissed at me, dragging me behind him through the crowd. Thomas Blood was all smiles as he stood to greet us and kiss my hand, pressing his wet lips against it for rather too long. "A rose indeed," he murmured, smiling into my eyes. "A pleasure to meet you, mistress." "The rose has more thorns than sweet flowers," John said, and roared with laughter at his own witticism as he gestured for me to sit beside the man on the settle by the fire. I cast him a sharp glance. I didn't trust him and was suspicious about this encounter. Was Thomas Blood looking for a mistress? It would not be the first time that John had tried to whore me out, though I had told him before in no uncertain terms that I would not do it. John had seen it as just another way to make money when times were hard, despite the fact that I was his wife. Such niceties, I had discovered, did not count with him. And there were men who would offer good coin to be able to say that they had bedded the sister of the king's whore. The colonel grinned and raised a hand to summon the barmaid, who darted over with plates piled high with steaming beef pudding. My mouth watered. I resolved that if I needed to walk out in high dudgeon, I would take the pie with me. "I might have guessed as much," the Colonel said, sloshing ale into the beaker beside him, "from Madame Elena Gwyn's sister." John and he, in great good humour, dug into their pies and seemed in no hurry to tell me the detail of their plan. I decided not to ask. The food was, for the moment, more important. Around us, the chatter and bustle of the alehouse swirled, the air thick with beer and the rich smell of meat. No one paid us much attention. Thieves and criminals were common here. A highwayman sat in the corner by the door, smoking a clay pipe and counting his gold. A couple of dishevelled gentlemen playing cribbage over by the privy entrance. Peg Cherry, the barmaid, was leaning over the next table to pour the customers more ale, tossing her black curls as she flirted with them, her breasts almost falling out of her gown. Both John and Thomas Blood were staring at her cleavage like a pair of youths whose tongues were hanging out. "So, mistress," Blood said, dragging his gaze from Peg and wiping the back of his hand over his fleshy lips, "you'll be wondering what this is all about." "In your own good time, sir," I said, but the sarcasm passed directly over him, which was probably just as well. He belched several times and patted his